completing the square when a equals 1. So completing the square is just another method to solve quadratic equations. So we've talked about 4 methods so far this year. Completing the square is the newest method. In order to solve by completing the square, a must equal 1, it has to, and it works best when b is even. Alright, so completing the square, if we're looking at a quadratic or an expression like x squared plus 6x, completing the square is a way to fill in this number so that this quadratic is equal to a perfect square. Okay, and what that's going to allow us to use the square root method to solve. So that's the whole point of completing the square. So in order to figure out, the easiest way to figure out what number would make this a perfect square is to use this formula. Follow these 2 steps. Take half the coefficient of x. So if we're looking, the coefficient of x is b. So we're going to take half of b, and then we are going to square that number. Once we have it, we add it to both sides. So let's try it out. In this problem, b is equal to 6. Well, 6 divided by 2, half of 6 would be 3. 3 squared gives us 9. And you can always check your work by factoring, right? 2 numbers that multiply to be 9 and add to be 6 are 3 and 3. Well, that number does in fact make this quadratic into a perfect square. So that's what we're doing when we are completing the square. Let's practice a couple more times. So if we're looking at some extra problems, we just want to complete the square. So we're just using that same formula, half of b, and then square it. So b divided by 2 squared. Well, when b is equal to 12, we have 12 divided by 2 squared, which leaves us with 6 squared. So that's 36, which would equal x plus 6 squared. Well, when we have 14 divided by 2 squared, well, that would be 7 squared, which is just 49. Okay. Well, 2 numbers that multiply to be 49 and add to be 14, that would be 7. So x plus 7 squared is our perfect square. When we have a negative number, well, we have negative 10 divided by 2, which is negative 5. Negative 5 squared is positive 25. Well, negative 5 times negative 5 is 25 and adds to be negative 10. So x minus 5 squared is our perfect square. And you can always multiply these out to check them. This last one, x squared plus 5x. Notice how 5 is an odd number. Well, 5 divided by 2 is going to leave us with 2.5. 2.5 squared is about 6.25. So notice when b isn't even, when b is an odd number, we just have fractions instead of nice whole numbers like we did previously. Another thing I want you guys to notice when you're writing your square root, so this number that we have when we square it, this number is the same as whatever b divided by 2 is. Okay, so the shortcut to find this factored form, you just take x and add whatever b divided by 2 is. So here, 14 divided by 2 gave us 7. Here, negative 10 divided by 2 gave us negative 5. Here, 5 divided by 2 gave us 2.5. So that's the shortcut. To sum this up, basically when you are factoring, you take x plus whatever b divided by 2 is. And then that's what your factor will look like every single time you're doing one of these problems. Well, let's put it all together to actually use this to solve a quadratic. So completing the square is basically all about following these steps. So these steps we have along the side. You want to memorize these as soon as possible. The more familiar you are with them, the easier this process will be. So we want to have a equal 1. Well, right here we've got 1x squared, so that's our first step. Then we move our c value to the other side. Well, the opposite of subtracting 24 is adding 24. So we have x squared plus 10x equal to 24. That's our step 2. Complete the square and then add that number to both sides. So we're going to take our b value of 10. b is equal to 10. We're going to take that, divide it by 2, and then square it. Well, 10 divided by 2 is 5. 5 squared is 25. So we are going to add 25 to both sides. And see what this does. Now when we get to step 4, we are ready to factor this. So when we factor it, we're going to have our x plus, and then our b divided by 2 in this case was just 5. So x squared plus 10x plus 25 is the same as x plus 5 squared, right? And this is the perfect square. That's our whole point. That's the entire reason we're talking about completing the square. So we can take a quadratic and we can make it into this perfect square. That's what we're doing here. And then on the other side, 24 plus 25 is just 49. So looking at what we have now, we have x plus 5 squared equals 49. Okay, so the beauty of completing the square is that since we have a perfect square on this left-hand side, we are able to use the square root method to solve the rest of this. So we're going to take the square of the left-hand side and of the right-hand side. Well, the square root of anything squared just cancel each other out. So these cancel out, and we are left with x plus 5. So now we have our x all by itself. So this is going to allow us to solve for x, right? Get that x isolated on one side. Square root of 49 is just 7. So we have our plus or minus 7. Well, we still need to get x completely by itself. So I'm going to subtract 5 on either side. So x is equal to negative 5 plus or minus 7. Well, negative 5 plus 7 is 2. Negative 5 minus 7 is negative 12. So those are our two solutions, or x-intercepts. Okay, so this is completing the square. Basically, you just follow these steps, right? Follow these steps again, memorize them as soon as you can. And the whole point of completing the square is so we can get something that we can take the square root of. Okay, that's the entire purpose of completing the square. That's what we're doing here. Let's look at one more example together. We have x squared plus 2x equals 35. Well, a is already equal to 1. C is already on the other side. So we just need to take b divided by 2 squared. Well, in this case, our b value is equal to 2. So we're going to take 2 divided by 2 squared. Well, 2 divided by 2 is just 1. 1 squared is just 1. So we're going to take that and we are going to add that on either side. We've got our x squared plus 2x equals 35. And then after we complete the square, we are going to add 1 on either side. So that's our step 3. Well, factor this completely. We're going to have our x plus our b divided by 2 value. So in this case, that's x plus 1 squared equals 35 plus 1 is just 36. So now we are ready to take the square root. We factored completely, and now we're just solving for x. So we can take the square root of either side. The square root of x plus 1 squared. Remember, these cancel each other out. That's why this method works. That's the whole point of what we're doing here. So we can get x plus 1 by itself equal to, well, the square root of 36 is just 6. So we're going to have positive or negative 6. Well, we still need to get x completely by itself. So I'm going to subtract 1 on either side. X is equal to negative 1 plus or minus 6. Well, negative 1 plus 6 is 5. Negative 1 minus 6 is negative 7. So x equals 5 and x equals negative 7. So once you have these steps down, this process becomes pretty fast. Okay, remember the steps, and also remember this is just another method. We've learned about the quadratic formula, about factoring, about the square root method. This is just one more method to solve a quadratic equation. It works best if b is even.